There are 9 Holy Knights of God, conveniently the exact same number of knights as the number of Luffy's crewmates, meaning theoretically everything is set up for a perfect lineup of final matchups. Luffy fighting Im, while Luffy's 9 subordinates fight Im's 9 subordinates. Should be pretty straightforward, right? Well, maybe, but right now we've got a long running list of potential endgame matchups for the crew. Luffy's final opponents seem relatively easy to predict, with Blackbeard and Im being near guaranteed opponents, and Akainu seeming to be at least highly likely, but when it comes to the rest of the Straw Hats, there are a lot of possibilities. Will we actually get to see Zoro and Sanji versus the Admirals, and if so, at what point and in what context? Similarly, at what point does Zoro versus Mihawk fit in the picture? Are the Gorosei not strong after all, or could they be stronger than God's Knights? What was all this build up to the Seraphim as the world government's ultimate weapons and the final line of defense for the Celestial Dragons if God's Knights exist? Honestly, in this final saga, the Straw Hats are actually facing down an ever-growing mountain of enemies. But we have some significant clues and guaranteed milestones that can help us break down the order of the upcoming matchups, and the most likely scenario that will play out. So before we get into it, make sure to subscribe for more One Piece content every week. And I want to know, what is the worst part about the end of your day? Is it cooking? Is it grocery shopping? If so, then you should be using HelloFresh, the sponsor for this video. HelloFresh is the meal prep service that delivers food straight to your door, giving you all the ingredients you need to quickly whip up a delicious meal, with easy to follow recipes that can be done in 15 minutes. That means no more time wasted going to grocery stores looking for ingredients, and cooking the meals becomes easier and quicker than ever. You don't even have to be a good chef since everything is pre-portioned and ready in just a few steps. Not to mention the quality is amazing. Their seasonal ingredients are picked at peak ripeness and they go from the farm to your home in less than a week. My life has been way easier ever since I started getting HelloFresh delivered straight to my door, because now I really don't have to shop for dinner at all. I get my meals ready to go and I can easily cook my meals in less time than it takes to watch an episode of anime. And the best part is, you can get 16 free meals literally today. Just go to HelloFresh.com and use code MrMorge16 for 16 free meals and free shipping. That's HelloFresh.com, code MrMorge16 for 16 free meals and free shipping. Link in the description below. So to begin with, the long-standing question of how many crewmates will Luffy ultimately have may have tentatively been answered, with the number capped at 9. This is not just because there are 9 members of God's Knights, but because this also conveniently mirrors the number of Titanic captains that Blackbeard has under his command. Now you might be typing below that no, Blackbeard has 10 Titanic captains, but it doesn't really make sense to count Aokiji, considering it has been made extremely clear that Aokiji is still a good person who is only allying with Blackbeard to carry out his own secret agenda. Unlike the rest of Blackbeard's crew, which is filled with the most heinous and evil criminals in history, as well as abusive jailers, policemen, and so on, Aokiji is a just man who is pursuing some just cause. We just don't know what it is yet, though I expand on that in this character analysis. If we assume that Oda hasn't randomly thrown Aokiji's character out the window, but Aokiji is simply continuing to follow his hidden, noble motivation that was established all the way back in Punk Hazard, that would mean that Blackbeard only has 9 true subordinates, which fittingly gives us some nice symmetry around the number 9 throughout the final saga. Luffy and his 9 Straw Hats, Blackbeard and his 9 captains, Im and his 9 knights. Actually, funnily enough, this has been a soft trend for a bit, with Oden and his 9 scabbards, Kaido and his 3 calamities, and 6 Tobiropo, meaning 9 officers, but that's not really relevant. The point is that we can see some strong potential matching lineups for the Straw Hats against the remaining 2 villain groups that we know must be defeated, the Blackbeard Pirates and the Celestial Dragons. However, God's Knights are not the only potential candidates for being Im's subordinates that the Straw Hats would fight. After all, we just spent so long building up to the Seraphim and are finally getting an idea of their extreme potential. The Admirals have always been the world government's ultimate heavyweight fighters, and the Gorosei have been long speculated by fans to be secretly among the world's strongest characters. Not to mention, here's the really tricky piece to reconcile: where does Mihawk fit into this whole equation? I am going to address that first. The reason that Mihawk makes figuring out final matchups so tricky is because we know 2 things. 1, Zoro has to fight Mihawk in the final saga. 2. It would make no sense for Zoro to fight Mihawk during the final war against the world government. Mihawk would obviously never be allied with the world government. He is in fact currently helping drive a kill all Marines agenda, and it would make no sense for Zoro to be having a personal duel against Mihawk while the rest of the Straw Hats are risking their lives to defeat the world government. That would just be absolutely bizarre. It would be incredibly selfish of Zoro to not participate in the most important battle the Straw Hats ever have just to do a personal duel for his own pride, and it would mean that Zoro would have no part in helping to bring the dawn of the world. So Mihawk has to fit in somewhere before the fight with the world government. But by extension, what that means is that Zoro's final world government opponent would have to be someone even stronger than Mihawk. That helps us narrow down the possibilities of who makes the most sense for the Straw Hats to be pitted against in their final battle in the story. Because of the Mihawk factor, I think we can safely cross off the Marines as the Straw Hats' final adversaries. To begin with, I want to say that I do think that Luffy versus Akainu is extremely likely, simply because the personal animosity there is far greater for Luffy than with any other villain in the story. Akainu was the one and only villain that broke Luffy and tore away what he loved most. Akainu was literally the singular cause for the turning point of Luffy as a character. Luffy has a far angrier reaction to hearing about Akainu than he does with even Blackbeard, and Akainu literally scarred Luffy, not just emotionally, but physically scarred him. The very symbol of Luffy's growth between pre and post timeskip is a mark by Akainu. Not to mention symbolically, Luffy's freedom versus Akainu's absolute justice is one of the most important thematic conflicts of the story. The dichotomy between pirates versus Marines is arguably the single most important dichotomy that has been emphasized throughout the entire story, and the symbolic clash of the king of the pirates fighting the leader of the Marines seems almost inevitable in the story, at least to me. And because Luffy versus Akainu seems likely, I've often thought that Zoro and Sanji versus the other admirals seems likely. It's very convenient actually. Much like Aokiji seems unlikely to actually be on Blackbeard's side in the endgame, so too does Fujitora seem unlikely to actually be on the world government side in the endgame, simply because it would go against literally everything that his character has been written to be about. There's no reason Fujitora would fight to stop the dawn of the world and enforce evil dictatorial authority. We saw what side Fujitora chose during Dressrosa. As such, things would line up nicely, with only 2 admirals being left in the endgame for Zoro and Sanji to fight. Luffy versus the Fleet Admiral, and Zoro and Sanji versus the 2 admirals. It's a fairly reasonable setup. However, we know that the admirals cannot be Zoro and Sanji's final opponents at this point, because of the Mihawk factor. As crazy as it is to say, the admirals would be too weak. Again, we know Zoro will have to fight Mihawk before the final battle against the world government, meaning we still need someone for Zoro to fight that is even stronger than Mihawk in that final battle, and neither Kizaru nor Ryukogyu fit the bill. That shouldn't be a controversial statement. Mihawk is likely stronger than an admiral, considering an admiral is terrified the very moment that they feel Shanks' haki, and Mihawk should at the very least be comparable to Shanks. So even if Zoro and Sanji get to fight admirals, they are likely going to have to fight someone even stronger to make for a better conclusion for them once it's time for Luffy to fight Im. I imagine that extends to the rest of the Straw Hats as well. Against the Marines, the lower Straw Hats would be relegated to potentially fighting Vice Admirals, which would honestly be somewhat disappointing for their final opponents. So now here is where I believed that the Seraphim had tremendous potential as the Straw Hats' true final opponents. I talked about this in a previous video, but when the Seraphim were hyped up to be the ultimate beings, it really seemed like it may not be hyperbole, simply because we had spent literally the entire New World setting up all these individual advanced scientific developments that were all leading up to this singular culmination of the perfect final product by the world's smartest man. Combining everything we'd been seeing so far, cloning, gigantification, bloodline elements, artificial devil fruits, all of it together to make what Vegapunk referred to as the most powerful beings. They were created specifically to replace the Shichibukai themselves, and have essentially been built up for hundreds and hundreds of chapters. Even now, they are giving Luffy and Zoro difficulty, and it has been stressed that they are in their infancy. They are nowhere near their full potential yet. Most importantly, they are specifically programmed to follow the Celestial Dragons, and symbolically, the very title Seraphim very literally means God's angels. That's largely why they're designed to look the way they do, as angelic, winged beings, but with a dark, sinister look, so as to reflect the nature of the dark god that they serve. So here we have a difficult comparison to make. Who are more likely to be Im's final subordinates? God's knights or God's angels? They both seem like they were introduced to play the same role. Now on the one hand, the Seraphim seem appealing to me as there is more setup around them. Let's say for example that God's knights are the final opponents for the Straw Hats, meaning let's say Zoro's final opponent is a member of the God Knights. If we were to find out that there has just randomly been a swordsman even stronger than Mihawk sitting up there in Marijua, then that would feel a little bit off to me. It's one thing to realize that hey, Im may have secretly been the strongest person in the world all along, even stronger than Roger and Whitebeard, because absolutely no one in the world is supposed to know that Im exists. It fits the narrative. But God's Knights are a little different in that they aren't that much of a secret. They are in fact a known entity. The revolutionaries all know about God's Knights. The Marines know about God's Knights. It would ring a little hollow to me if there was a known swordsman stronger than Mihawk all along, but was just never talked about because they stayed in Marijua. I feel like with the Seraphim, it's not as though there are randomly a bunch of super-powered characters all along that the world government had that were just never mentioned, but rather this is a group of super-powered characters that actually had to be created as brand new additions to the story with a tremendous amount of setup. And while it's entirely possible that Oda only ever wrote the Seraphim just to serve as opponents for the Egghead Island arc, I do feel that that would be a shame simply because it's been stressed so much that they are not yet at their full potential, and are still simply children. It would be strange to never get to see what the full potential is of these supposedly ultimate creations that all these scientific developments across so many arcs have been leading towards. However, on the flip side, the idea of God's Knights ultimately being the more important of Im's subordinates and the true final opponents for the Straw Hats rather than the Seraphim, that idea is still appealing to me simply because I do like the symmetry of it. 9 subordinates against 9 subordinates. If the Seraphim were the final opponents, some Straw Hats wouldn't get fights. On top of this, I can't help but admit that I like the idea of the shiny new object of mystery. At a point in One Piece where we thought we pretty much knew all the strongest characters and haven't had any real surprise new additions to the top tiers since Im was revealed 200 chapters ago, finding out that Im has a squad of 9 potentially elite fighters is exciting. And they could certainly make for more interesting opponents as characters than the manufactured Seraphim who have very limited personalities so far. There is the other in-between option, which is that the Straw Hats' final matchups may be a mix between Seraphim and the God's Knights. After all, there are going to be other forces involved in the final battle as well, likely Dragon, Sabo, and the Revolutionaries, and other allied forces on the Straw Hats side, of course. So much like in the Onigashima battle, just because Kaido had 9 officers, it did not mean that the 9 Straw Hats were all matched up against all 9 officers. Maybe there's a bit of mixing and matching in this final battle in the final saga as well, with maybe some Straw Hats fighting God's Knights, some fighting Seraphim, and various matchups being passed around to the Straw Hat allies and Revolutionary Army members. And lastly, beyond the Seraphim and God's Knights, I want to address the potential of the Gorosei. Yes, I understand that the Gorosei have paralleled previous pillars of God like Enel's priest or Doflamingo's family heads. And yes, I understand that one of the Gorosei members has a sword that seems like it could be even one of the legendary Kitetsu blades. However, I have long believed and honestly still believe that the Gorosei are ultimately not top tier fighters. The reason for this is simply presentation. I think consistently throughout the story, Oda really likes to give his strongest characters fittingly impactful introductions, revealing them in dramatic, memorable ways to evoke excitement in the reader. Think Mihawk, think Dragon, think every Shichibukai, and every Yonko. Even if a character isn't shown to be strong right away, like Blackbeard, his introduction scene is still a dramatic and memorable one. With the Gorosei, it was actually the opposite. They weren't even the standout characters in the chapter they were introduced. Rather, they were just the announcers of the main highlight of the chapter, Doflamingo and Kuma's introduction. I think consistently throughout the story, the Gorosei have been used more so to hype up other characters and just explain ongoing events throughout the world. And they aren't really given any sort of dramatic aura around them the way that Oda tends to write his most powerful characters. That's not to say that the Gorosei might not be strong, I just don't think they're admiral level like some readers believe. So looking at the entirety of the story remaining, I personally believe the key 3 beats for the Straw Hat Pirates in terms of upcoming conflicts will look something like this. Straw Hat Pirates versus Blackbeard Pirates, Straw Hats versus Marines, with Luffy versus Akainu and hopefully Zoro and Sanji versus the Admirals, and finally Straw Hats versus the Celestial Dragons, with Luffy versus Im, and the crew versus either God's Knights or the Seraphim or some mix between the two. But let me know how you think the future matchups will play out in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this video then definitely like and subscribe, and you can get my extended thoughts on this and all future topics by becoming a patron, link in the description below.